looks in terms, a lot of patients with heterotaxy will have D-loop ventricles or L-loop ventricles, and once you figure out which ventricle is which, you can apply the hand rule. Sometimes it's hard to tell which ventricle is which, or you may have a single ventricle and you're not sure if it's right ventricle or left. Then in those cases, you cannot apply the hand rule. Then we look at the ventricular arterial connections, and again, in case of heterotaxy, often we'll have multiple cardiac abnormalities, so we try to look at one piece at a time, optimizing the imaging both at every point in time. So this I meant to mention. So this is the patient with transposition, showed you earlier. Very common to have transposition with the heterotaxy, particularly asplenia type. And then outflow tract obstruction with pulmonary stenosis or aortic stenosis can be quite common, particularly pulmonary stenosis can be very common with heterotaxy. Pulmonary stenosis is common in general. Pulmonary valve abnormalities, maybe 10% of congenital heart disease has pulmonary stenosis or even more. And even in heterotaxy, it's pretty common to have pulmonary valve abnormalities. Now, systemic outflow obstruction, aortic stenosis or coarctation, is less common, interestingly, with heterotaxy. But polysplenia type heterotaxy patients can have left-sided obstructions, or systemic outflow obstruction, I should say, even hypoplastic left heart. So again, one of the reasons why it's important to know if it tends to be polysplenia or asplenia is if you see a patient with heterotaxy, stomach on one side, the heart on the other, hypoplastic left heart, maybe an interrupted IVC, should be thinking polysplenia type heterotaxy. Maybe this patient is at risk not just for splenic abnormalities and intestinal abnormalities, but maybe specifically heart block or bradycardia, so may require a pacemaker. So it's useful to have this background in heterotaxy in terms of counseling. And then the outflow tract obstruction, particularly pulmonary stenosis, can evolve in utero. So at 20 weeks when you make the diagnosis, there may not be much pulmonary stenosis, maybe mild or moderate, and the ductal flow may be normal, right to left. But over time, the pulmonary stenosis can worsen, and you can develop retrograde flow in the ductus, and that's a sign that this baby is probably going to be ductal dependent after birth. So it's important when you're counseling to mention these possibilities and also just to follow so that you make sure you deliver these babies in the right hospital. This is just an example of a baby with polysplenia with atrial bradycardia. There's atrial bradycardia because sometimes babies with polysplenia have no sinus node, so they have an atrial rhythm that's relatively slow, maybe 80, 100 beats per minute. And they also are at risk for developing heart block. So in terms of delivery, if we have a patient, a fetal patient with heterotaxy, if there is significant heart disease, for sure, these babies should deliver, for those pregnancies that are continuing, should deliver at a tertiary care center where there's the expertise to take care of not just the heart, but also if there's a need for GI surgery, for a LADS procedure for intestinal obstruction, or other abnormalities that may go along with heterotaxy, tertiary care center makes sense as the ideal place to deliver some of these patients. And also, of course, like for most patients, it's probably best to deliver at term. For obvious reasons, if we're going to require surgery or a pacemaker implantation, or a shunt, if there's severe pulmonary stenosis, the bigger the baby, the better. And in general, we like to deliver these babies with heterotaxy via normal, spontaneous vaginal delivery, rather than by C-section. Now, of course, there are exceptions. the babies with obstructed total anomalous pulmonary venous return who may require surgery or cardiac catheterization to stent the ductus venosus soon after birth, those babies should not be electively delivered at 2 in the morning whenever they're ready to come out. They need to be delivered during the day when everyone with the required expertise is available in the hospital. And of course, if there's complete heart block, the babies cannot be adequately monitored for fetal well-being during labor. So those babies probably should be delivered by section as well. And many of them do require implantation of a pacemaker soon after birth. So many patients with heterotaxy actually do quite well. They're not all very bad prognoses. Some of them have very good prognoses, but of course there are elements to some that we can pick up even at 20 weeks in terms of counseling, when we can say this baby's heterotaxy is a very high risk form. What are some of those factors we're looking for? Of course we're looking for single ventricle. Heterotaxy with single ventricle, that's a bad prognostic factor. If you have a single ventricle and you have obstructed total anomalous pulmonary venous return, most of those patients just a few years ago could not survive anywhere in the world. Now sometimes they are surviving, but those are the exceptions. It's a very poor prognosis to have heterotaxy, single ventricle, total anomalous pulmonary venous return. Patients with heart block and heterotaxy also have a worse prognosis. They need to be paced, many of them from soon after delivery, and can develop pacemaker-induced cardiomyopathy and other complications related to pacing over time. Some patients have significant valvular regurgitation early on, 18 weeks, 20 weeks, that you can pick up with color flow imaging. Valvular regurgitation early on, second trimester, is not a good sign. It's another negative prognostic factor. Sometimes we could see the foraminal valley is restrictive. That can be a tough diagnosis to make sometimes, but if you do see a restrictive foraminal valley, those patients are at risk for heart failure or hydrops. Patients, of course, who are hydropic. A hydropic fetus with heterotaxy is a very guarded prognosis and high risk for fetal demise, as well as poor survival after birth. And then, of course, many patients have associated structural abnormalities with heterotaxy, and that could make the prognosis that much more guarded. And some patients with heterotaxy do have aneuploidy. They do have chromosomal abnormalities that can be significant and can impact cognitive function, renal function. So patients with aneuploidy and heterotaxy tend to have a worse prognosis than those patients with normal genotypes. So here's just an example of a patient I saw that was sent to me, had a positive screen for Down syndrome and had an AV canal. So you can see the AV canal defect here, but had, as it turns out, a common atrium. And on the right, it's hard to see here, but the left side of the veins came over in here, and the right side of the veins came over on the right. So that's what we call ipsilateral pulmonary venous return. So it's a baby with an AV canal, common atrium, ipsilateral pulmonary venous return. This baby ended up not having Down syndrome, but had polysplenia. So the counseling was quite different, and the prognosis was different than a baby with trisomy 21. This is how a knowledge of some kind of how things tend to go together with polysplenia versus asplenia can be useful. So take-home points from before we do some scanning is that the segmental approach and how you mentally reconstruct the heart. When I do it in my mind, I'm thinking with the abdomen and the abdomen. abdominal viscera, and then the cardiac position. And then I go forward from there. The, oops, sorry, wait, 1 second. Wait, sorry about that. Pulmonary veins are very important to evaluate with heterotaxy because they're quite common and because they could have an important impact on prognosis in terms of how you counsel and in terms of where you deliver and how you deliver. Conceivably may require a C-section. But they may be difficult to detect. Even TEPVR may be difficult, even when you do all the kinds of things that we're talking about today in terms of optimizing image. It's maybe easier to evaluate them at 30 weeks. At 30 weeks, maybe 25% of cardiac output goes to the lungs. So keep that in mind on serial evaluation. If you're not sure about the veins at 20 weeks, it'll be easier later on to see. And then there may be progression of disease. There may be obstruction of the pulmonary veins that develops later, obstruction of the pulmonary inflow valley that develops later. There can be outflow tract obstruction like pulmonary stenosis that develops late, AV block, or valvular regurgitation or hydrops, all can evolve over time. And the most guarded prognosis with heterotaxy is for single ventricle patients with, especially those with heart block or obstructed TEPVR. But I also want to emphasize that not every baby follows the rules. There are some babies who do better than we think. And that's why when I'm counseling patients, I need to explain all the data, but also tell them that there are, not to always to lose hope. There are patients who do quite good, better than you might think, and it's important to be honest with the family about what we know and what we don't know. So this is one of my patients who comes to my symposium at UCLA every year. He's actually, I think he's 6 years old now, almost 6 years old. We diagnosed him with asplenia and unbalanced AV canal and double outlet right ventricle and obstructed total anomalous pulmonary venous return. So this was a high risk group, right, with multiple risk factors for a guarded prognosis. But he has done quite well, and he's ready for his Fontan now. And you would see him in a supermarket or playing soccer, and you would never know that he has a heart defect. Now, he is the exception. We need to be honest with patients that most patients do not do this well, but some can do very well with a lot of support from the family and with a good medical team. Xin cảm ơn.
Xin cảm ơn bài thuyết giảng của giáo sư Slensky. Bây giờ sẽ là thời gian dành cho phần hướng dẫn thực hành của giáo sư.
Đây là ngôi thuận nhé, dạ dày đây này, động mạch chủ nhé. Thì em đọc cái tên nữa anh Tuyến là nếu động bên trái thì có một cái ở sau đây đúng không? Đúng. Nếu phải
động bên trái và một bên phải là acipus, còn hoặc là có bên trái là hemiacipus, tùy. Còn trong đây là bên trái nhé, phải thì em sẽ thấy là chủ nhé, em sẽ thấy cả AVC cùng với hai cái bây giờ đây thì em thấy cái chủ ở phía sau.
Nhưng mà căn này có một ca nó nằm ngay ngang như nào? Thầy cho ca ngang.
Từ thì đôi khi nó cũng lên ngang nhưng mà không phải là các số của số này.
Trước và bằng cùng bên.
Bình thường là như này.
Nhưng mà nếu mà nó nằm cạnh như vậy chắc chắn là aziot đúng không?
Còn hai cái nó nằm chung là rhizosis.
ban nhà phân phối độc quyền.
chiều nay được như giáo sư nói
Khi thực hành hoặc là trong khi giờ chuẩn bị, nếu các chị nào có câu hỏi, các chị có thể đặt rồi mình sẽ dịch lại để nhờ giáo sư trả lời ha. Tại vì cái giờ mình cũng hơi sáng á, cho nên trong quá trình mình thực hành hoặc là các chị muốn cần xem thêm những cái chi tiết gì thì các chị cứ nói cho biết để mình có thể dịch. Thì chắc giờ Tuấn Anh trực tiếp luôn phải không ạ? Tuấn Anh dịch trực tiếp luôn hả Tuấn Anh? Xin giới thiệu các chị là bác sĩ Tuấn Anh đó, là cái người phiên dịch đã cho chúng ta trong cái ngày hôm nay. Đây là cái chuyên gia và nói là gần như là không có người thứ hai có thể so sánh được đấy, là về cái vấn đề trong y khoa về dịch đuổi như vậy.
rất dễ hiểu.
Rồi, trước bên viện nhi ông đấy cứ
Hôm qua uống nay đọc lại rồi chứ. Hôm qua uống đọc lại rồi hôm qua